All right, it's April 16, 2017, and all praises to the Most High Power of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Today, I want to talk to us about Satan. And so this is going to be a few videos. So it's going to be a series on my study on Satan, and been wanting to do this for a while. I've got so many topics that's just been a while in the making. But I'm glad to get to this one. Satan, now dealing with his appearances in the Bible. So in this first video on this topic, Satan seems to be extremely limited in the Old Testament, but he seems to have reserved his blood-curdling devilish temptations for the believers of the New Testament. In the Hebrew Bible, Satan doesn't seem to appear much in Torah, and he's actually in large part, if not fully, ignored by the Creator. It seems like even in the book of Job, he got a conversation with the Creator only because he showed up at a certain point. And we know in the book of Job, Job being a poetry book, you wonder if he actually was mentioned there, or the word Satan was used for the effect that it would have being a book of poetry, if they were trying to say something convey a certain idea by using Satan, the word Satan. Because through my studies now, it does not appear to me that Satan is this real person. You see, when I was in the Christian church from a small boy up, I got to understanding over the years that Satan was this particular master being, this master angel that was just as powerful as the Creator, but on the opposite side. So he was evil, and he was fighting against God, and God was doing his best to try to save people in spite of him. Now I understand that that's just hogwash, and it doesn't even seem to me that this Satan is real. In fact, I'll just tell you now, from what I've studied, he is not real. They just made him up. So I just want to go through my findings on it and see if that can, help you with your own studies as you look into him as well. And as I've said before in other videos, don't just take my word for it. Go and study, do your own research, learn. Because I'm learning from people too by buying all these books and studies. I got 3 books here I want to show you something about when dealing with this Satan. And the interesting thing is that I'm not going to show you what they said about Satan. I'm going to show you what they did not say about him. That's going to come at the end. So, dealing with the Old Testament now. He hardly is in the Old Testament. But in the poetry books, Satan occurs over 10 times. Mostly in the book of Job, and we can understand because there was this situation with Job, so he got a lot of play right there in that book. But over 10 times, and most of that is in the book of Job alone. Why isn't he spread out more over the Old Testament, terrorizing Hebrews all over the Old Testament? He seemed to have hated this guy Job for some reason. Satan appears, that's the poetry book, Satan appears one time in the history books, just once. And, that just means that the Hebrews did not concern themselves much with him at all. So, this also means that he, Satan, or it, was not a major player in Old Testament life. Like, they didn't really seem to care much about this guy, you would think that if you are a creature that fell from heaven, and you are there in the Old Testament times, the Hebrews are there in Old Testament times, where we are told that spirits made more appearances in more visible manners than in a more visible manner than and much more frequency than today. Why weren't the Hebrews just seeing this Satan running around all the time, tempting them to do all kinds of stuff? Nobody ever saw one of the wicked Israelite kings somehow in his bedchamber, or one of his back rooms in his big mansion, in some kind of secret meeting with Satan while he's there cursing them to do evil and telling them, yeah, this is how you can do it, man. This is how you can trick the people and set up this other god. This is how you can. No, nobody ever run into that, right? Because they were doing it from their own heart, deciding to not follow Torah, not because Satan was tempting them to do anything. Like the Most High said, I placed before you two paths, good and evil, life and death. Choose which one you're going to walk in. So bad things are going to happen when you choose the evil path, not because Satan is tempting you to do anything, because he doesn't exist. People made him up. Even from ancient Egypt and before, they made up this creature and worshipped it as a god. So he appeared this one time in that book. So he wasn't a major player in what the children of Jacob were doing. You know, if he wasn't such a major player, then that means that the children of Jacob were just going about their business. They're ransacking, the lands of the other people that the Most High said, like the Canaanites, for them to take over the land because of their own wickedness and so on. And Satan couldn't seem to stop them. He didn't seem to really, he didn't have a place in the story. He didn't have a place. But as time went on, we saw the New Testament come on the scene. All of a sudden, Satan is like this central character and has as much prominence as Jesus or as any of the apostles did, certainly Apostle Paul. So Israelites then, they didn't sin because Satan was tempting them, but just because they were choosing to not follow the laws of the Most High. They just wanted to do their own thing. They were watching the other nations around them. So in the history book now, the verse he's mentioned in one time in the history book is 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 1. And when you deal with Chronicles, that name alone is telling you that it deals with time, like Chronos from the Greek, time. So it's like a year-by-year account or something like that, right? Where it's just giving you a list of different events that happened. And so then I'm left to understand that in the Chronicles of Israel, or in the history books of Israel, Satan seemed to have been mentioned only one time in all of that history, where it says here, and Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1. Like he didn't seem to play a big part in Israel's downfall either. Because look at how many other times Israel fell, even in the book of Judges. Satan wasn't anywhere in that. The Bible would have told us that. Because if Satan is the problem in all of these things, then why didn't the Bible tell us that Satan was causing all of these things? But the New Testament is quick to tell you that Satan is causing you to sin. He goes around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So you can blame it on him and forget about your own wicked heart for not following Torah and following the instructions of the Creator. Let's blame it on Satan because Satan makes me sin. That way, you don't have to really repent from your heart and turn to God. You can just say, I'm sorry, but don't actually turn and do the sorry by turning to Torah, because you are not sorry. You are a blamer of Satan. You blame Satan. But if you were blaming yourself and say, look how godless I am, you would then turn to the Creator, right? And keep his Torah. Okay, so that's the poetry books, mostly 10 times in Job, 1 time alone in the history books, in the Bible, only 1 time for this presence of this creature. But in the major prophets now, the major prophets expressed no information about him or in any major way. You know, they're not mentioning him and crediting him with evil or temptation in any way, it seems. Major prophets. Isaiah now, in Isaiah 14 and probably about verse 12, they're saying, let me see if I can read that actually. Here, what Isaiah said. Because this, it says, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? And it doesn't seem that the prophets talked much about this Lucifer. They can't find them spending any time dealing with it, right? They spend time dealing with Israel or dealing with the other nations, because man is where it's at. People. If you're sinning, you're sinning. You're just not doing the Creator's instructions. That's you. That's not the devil. So why wouldn't a major prophet like Isaiah talk more about this, or any of the other prophets talk more about Satan? They're focusing on people, because people is where the problem is at. People. People are wicked. People are evil. People hate the Creator. And that's just the truth. So they find somebody to blame it on: Satan. So Isaiah just mentioned this one time and passed by, but the New Testament makes a big deal of this Lucifer or this Satan. So the major prophets, they don't seem to really know this Satan creature that supposedly fell from heaven. I mean, they don't seem that well acquainted with him. It's like, how can you explain that? The prophets of Israel spent a lot of the time prophesying to Israel about their transgressions and warning them that they're going to go into judgment for these things that they're doing. But they cannot be wise enough to tell the people, your problem is Satan. We need to have some all-night prayer meetings here. We'll call up Amos and Hezekiah and the other prophets, and we'll storm this thing in prayer and fight Satan, because he's assaulting the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of the Most High. They don't deal with stuff like that, but the New Testament does that kind of stuff. So the prophets now the major prophets more told the children of Israel that it was a personal choice of theirs to ignore Torah, instead of telling them, Satan is making you do all these things. You need to fight him. So all they were basically saying to them is, you need to return to the instructions of the Most High. Not that you need to rebuke the devil to get him off your back. Because rebuking the devil to get him off your back, that's not going to help you keep Torah anyway, because you're still going to be breaking it if you don't actually stop breaking it. Satan isn't doing any of this stuff. You are doing it. You're not keeping the Torah that was given unto your forefathers, and you need to return to that. And stop talking about your Satan that you learned from the other nations around you. So they didn't get into all that kind of stuff. So you see, the poetry books and the history books and the major prophets, they don't have much information about the Satan, because he was not a concern. They didn't think that he mattered. Why? Because they knew that the heathen nations around them worshiped Satan, and Satan was made by them in their myths. They knew Satan was their gods. It was one of their gods. So the prophets, knowing that Satan was just a made-up god by the other nations, they didn't concern themselves with Satan, because Satan, if you make up Satan in your mind and form a myth out of it and make some statue to represent Satan in your heathen nation, that don't have anything to do with us over here in Israel. We're breaking our Torah because we are breaking our Torah. You know, that's, I said, it don't mean that the Satan that you made up in your story and form your myth is making us do this, right? Minor prophets now, they croaked out this Babylonian nomenclature, Satan or Lucifer, with a minor mention found only in 2 verses. Isn't that a shame for such a master worldwide tempter? Satan is tempting the whole world. He's destroying all these other heathen kingdoms by forcing them to do evil, until the Creator is threatening to destroy them and bring them into judgment as well. And he is ransacking and assaulting the people of Jacob and terrorizing the kingdom of the Hebrews. And he only gets mentioned twice in the minor prophets. The minor prophets spend their time telling Israel how they need to change, how they need to return. And no wise prophet of God, skilled in the wisdom of Torah, ever takes the time with a message from the Creator to tell them that their real problem is that they're not focusing on rebuking Satan. Huh? So he hardly gets any mention in Torah, but we find out that the New Testament now, listen to this, has more verses, 34 verses, with nearly half of these being about 15 verses found in the Gospels alone. Paul himself, who never sat with Jesus, he alone has 10 verses to himself in his epistles. And the general epistles have no mention of Satan. None. But Paul, the newcomer, the new kid on the block, he has 10 of these verses. You see what that's showing me now is that the New Testament has an overwhelming conditioning of the mind toward this being. The New Testament, made by the Romans, after the Hebrews were taken down, they came up with this stuff. And they seem to have known Satan so well that they could include him in the new book. But the Hebrews didn't seem to have much to say about this Satan creature. All right, this is the first lesson in this series dealing with Satan. I'm going to get into some more juicy information as time goes on, but at least you can see I'm setting the stage here, showing you where this Satan came from. He didn't come from no heaven. He didn't fall down from heaven. That's myth. They made him up. Ancient Egypt, Babylon, Persia, all that history is going to show you where this Satan came from. So look out for the next one. In the next video, I'm going to talk about Satan in other religions, like in the Baha'i religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, New Age, witchcraft, Islam. I'm going to talk about that. Now, to close out this, I'm going to show you 3 books here I mentioned at the start, and it's going to show you what they didn't say about Satan. To show again that just as the Old Testament shows that there's not that much, overwhelming information in Satan, because he's just a fake, and it's just trickery the way they worded him into the scriptures. It's trickery. This book here, Insights Handbook of Old Testament Background. I hope you can see this properly. Insights Old Testament Background. And listen to so obviously that says it's giving some background of what life might have been like in the Old Testament. Table of contents, saying stuff like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So basically, the contents here are telling you that these chapters are dealing with the background of Old Testament life, the setting in Old Testament life in each book of the Old Testament. But the contents are not, table of contents are not listing anything about Satan. So if they do mention Satan somewhere later in the book, it might just be a small mention for some reason, but it's not like they're really finding much information to talk about. Look at this other one, Themes in Old Testament Theology by William Jarnis. This is actually this is a good book actually. I'm reading this one right now, but slow because I'm reading lots of books. So the self-revelation of God, that's chapter 1, and they got self-revelation of God, dealing a lot with Genesis and Exodus. Chapter 2, the nature of God, the media of revelation, angel of the Lord, face of God, anthropomorphism, nature of God, God is personal, holiness of God, power of God, character and activity of God. Nothing here about Satan so far. Chapter 3, creation and providence, completion and creation, God's continuing relationship to creation. Then you deal with the creation of man and woman. They're not talking about Satan anywhere, coming in no garden. Origin of sin, the fall, the boundary of fellowship, vocabulary and definition of sin, deviation, guilt, rebellion. And it's interesting that this author here is saying that he actually believes in the New Testament. I don't, but he's saying that the people who believe in the New Testament should give some attention to the Old Testament, because he's saying that you cannot properly understand what's going on in the New Testament if you don't understand what happened in the Old Testament. So he's at least presenting that. But even though he believes in the New Testament, I don't find him here mimicking the New Testament information about Satan so heavily, because so far he doesn't seem to want to, he's not in a hurry to talk about Satan. More of his information, the covenant, the law, background and development of the concept of law, some basic legal sections, the law and neighboring peoples around Israel, character of law, comprehensive scope. He's dealing with worship. Nothing here about Satan fighting people from worshiping the Creator. Theological character of piety, the fear of the Most High, faith in God, ethics, basics of Old Testament ethics and so on, ordinances, religion for common man. He's dealing with all kinds of stuff. Moses as the first prophet, the hope of Israel, vision of the kingdom, all kinds of stuff. But he doesn't seem to want to give any information about Satan himself. So you're finding that these theologians then, they're not even concerned about telling you anything about Satan. But when you open the New Testament that some of them believe in, it's talking about Satan so much. He's going around like a roaring lion, seeing if he can find people to devour. Strange. New Testament seems to know him so much, but the Old Testament doesn't really seem to have much information about him. Look at this other book now. This is actually a good book as well. Hebrew Origins. And it's talking about the origins of the Hebrew people, law, God, priesthood, and prophecy. And let's look at their table of contents to see if they were spending a lot of time talking about Satan. Chapter 1, the origin of the Hebrew people. Chapter 2, the origin of Hebrew law. Chapter 3, the origin of the Hebrew God. Then you got the origin of the Hebrew priesthood, origin of Hebrew prophecy, and the origin of Hebrew monotheism. He does not seem to want to talk anything about Satan either. Let me just scan through it quickly. See if Satan pops up anywhere on one of the pages in a quick scan. No. He's talking about the Hebrews, their travels, their journeys, Jericho, Joshua, Egypt, Ramesses II, all kind of stuff. Nothing. He doesn't seem to really care about Satan, Mount Sinai, Israel, the judges, Levi. No. These theologians, these people, and look at this one too. The Hebrew origins. You would figure that if the Hebrews were fighting Satan all the time, or if Satan was fighting the Hebrews, they would have had lots of information talking about their wars fighting Satan or Lucifer. What we find though is that the Hebrews weren't fighting Satan, but they were fighting like the Canaanites, and the Canaanites were fighting back at them. Esau was fighting them. All these different people were fighting the Hebrews. These different nations, ancient nations, were fighting the Hebrews. But that's what you find in the Old Testament. But in the Old Testament, you don't find Satan was fighting the Hebrews like all these other nations. That's why the prophets were prophesying about the wars with the other nations. And that's why kings were crying out for help from the Most High in battle to save them from these other kingdoms that they were fighting. The Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, all these wars. They were crying out in battle for the Most High to save them because Satan is fighting them. So why does Satan get this big play in the New Testament? My first lesson, thank you for listening. I'll be back with part 2 for this as I go on talking some more about Satan to expose that doofus.